So, welcome to St Hilda's College in this glorious weather and in beautiful surroundings to celebrate the life, achievements and memories of college's much-loved fellow emerita of medieval English, Celia Sisam. And before I continue, if I may, a brief note of housekeeping. Although the memorial is being recorded, some speakers have asked not to be filmed, so please may I ask you, in turn, not to take photographs. So thank you so much for coming today to pay tribute to a most dedicated tutor, fellow and scholar, and to share your special memories with others. Indeed, 45 minutes ago, one of Celia's students, Val McDermott, named the room hosting the fiction library after her, so that her name will forever be in the hearts and minds of new generations of our students. And while we form part of the Collegiate University of Oxford, a place of great learning and research, the core is our people, the students who study here, and the tutors who impart their knowledge and who teach our students to think critically. This very special relationship is one that lasts a lifetime, and we're looking forward to the many stories that can and will be told. Indeed, many of you here today bear witness to this, as you've gone on to influence the world around you in a myriad of ways. We will hear about Celia's dedicated service to the college, her pride in her scholarship and teaching, her passion for life after St Hilda's in the Isles of Scilly. Her college recognises with gratitude her steadfast commitment over more than 30 years, and we are honoured to be able to provide the opportunity for everyone to share tales of her life and work, and I hope you enjoy the afternoon ahead.
Celia Sisam was fellow and tutor in English here at St Hilda's from 1957 to 1986. She had been a tutor here for 16 years. When I met her in May 1973, I'd come to St Hilda's from abroad, originally from South Africa, but more immediately from Columbia University in New York. And I was here to be interviewed for one of the new research fellowships for women, which the Rhodes Trust had offered to what were then the 5 women's colleges. I was introduced to Celia, then aged 47, and her colleague Anne Elliott, amongst the interviewers in the Canada room. The fellows, and there seemed to me a lot of them, not just an interviewing committee, but a good number of the fellows of the college, were grouped on one side of the long table in that room. Their heads appeared to me so close together that they seemed like a medieval picture. And I sat on the other side of the table, of course, on my own. Celia and Anne did not ask me any questions. They left the interview entirely to Dame Helen Gardner, who had been formerly tutor in English here and then at that time had moved to Lady Margaret Hall as Professor of English. Afterwards, Celia and the chemistry tutor, Margaret Christie, kindly asked me for supper in Margaret Christie's rooms. And their hospitality was really endearing. Through them, I had an impression of the character of the college at its best. It was then, of course, and for a long time to come, a women's college. And what struck me was comfy domesticity, honesty, naturalness, nothing showy. What mattered I could hear it in their voices, was consideration and awareness of others. I dropped something. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. The Michaelmas term when I arrived here, that of 1973, I was expected to assist with the entrance, and though I understood, little though I understood of the intricacies of the Oxford exercise, Celia's colleague, Anne Elliot, set an extraordinarily high standard, and the marks of the applicants were rather poor. I remember Celia's exact words, "Charity, Anne, charity." Celia herself made, I saw, wise choices based on character. She intimated that what she was looking for were women who were, and I'm quoting, sturdy and vigorous. I was astonished because I was expecting, they would be looking for brilliance, and perhaps Anne Elliot was. But later I came to understand how crucial these qualities were if a student was to thrive. Celia, I remembered, when I thought back, I remembered one instance of advice from Celia and one instance of reproof. Her advice came when I myself, in about 1984, became a fellow and tutor in English, and we were setting up our first drinks party for our students, putting out the drink and the snacks, and Celia said to me to note that chocolates were really the most important item, and that I never forgot that. It did prove true. As for her reproof, once when I expressed pleasure in walks around Christchurch Meadow after lunch while I was a research fellow, I used to take strolls now and then with a philosopher called Margaret Gilbert. Celia admonished me. This was actually in an article requested by the American Oxonian when I returned to America for a while. And Celia read it, and then when I was back at St Hilda's, she was quite put out by that, because she reminded me, and rightly, how very hard tutors work. It's true, and that there was no option to go strolling around Christchurch Meadow after lunch. I wouldn't have associated Celia with rebellion, yet there was one in her early days in college. I think it must have been 1957-58, and Celia was part of that rebellion. And the following story is pure hearsay, but I hope you'll trust me that I will tell it to you accurately. In the senior common room, Celia told me, and I remember that the Roman historian Barbara Levick was there, they were egging each other on. They said that when they were young tutors, it was the older dons instructed them. They called the older dons privately the ladies, and Dame Helen Gardner was one of them, then an honorary fellow of the college, but she often came in. It had been her home for a long time, and she was devoted to St Hilda's, and they instructed the younger dons how to vote at governing body, and they were not free to have their own opinions, and they resented this. They made it clear to me, and they objected in the following way. It was the custom for the younger dons to pour coffee after dinner for the ladies, and one evening they just didn't. It was an entirely successful declaration of independence. It was usual then for almost all the tutors to live in college as well as teach here, And I remember Celia's light-filled teaching room overlooking the river. Don't want to say too much because I know Alison is going to describe that. It was next to the principal's room. Mrs. Bennett was principal at that time, and the room of the college secretary, Verity Brown. And as you went into that room, Celia met one gently, quite gravely, with a view to whatever had to be discussed, yet exuding a warm benevolence. She taught Anglo-Saxon and Middle English and the language option in English to those who chose it in their second and final year. And she was known for the Oxford Book of Medieval Verse, published in 1970. Mary Moore, who was principal when Celia retired in 1986, appreciated, quote, her goodness, unfailing warmth, and a reassuring presence in the senior common room. And in governing body, said Mrs. Moore, she never lost sight of what must be the twin beacons of academic standards and the primacy of the interest of junior members. My first governing body in Michaelmas term of 1984, I sat down next to Celia, and again she surprised me. I would have thought her a stickler for the rules, but looking down, I noticed that she secreted on her lap a gardening book, and she was looking down with great interest at it. She saw that I was unused to the politics of the governing body, and quietly, she warned me that sooner or later I'd get a difficult letter, shall we say, from one of the dons there. And she warned me and she advised me to take it calmly as something that would be inevitable. I couldn't have had a wiser or kinder colleague. Thank you.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me. My name's Alison Shell. I was at St Hilda's reading English, then doing a doctorate between 1984 and 1991. And I now teach English at UCL. And I'm going to be talking today about Celia as teacher. You've got to go to St Hilda's. Celia Sisam is a fellow there. So I was told by Robin Myers, one of my sixth form tutors, and a close friend of Celia's. And being something of a 19th century separatist feminist at the time, I'd been weighing up the respective merits of Somerville and St Hilda's, the only two Oxford colleges that were still women-only in 1983. And Robin Myers was so very certain about St Hilda's, I felt I really couldn't go against her. So off I went to the school library, and I looked up Celia Sisam. And I'd have had more to go on these days because of JSTOR. But they did have a copy of Celia's Anthology of Medieval Verse. They did have a copy of Kenneth Sisam's 14th century verse and prose, and I thought to myself, as Private Eye was already given to saying in the 1980s, I wonder if by any chance they are related. And it all added to the mystique that had already attached itself to Celia's name in my mind. I do remember how beautifully both volumes were pitched for an entry-level medievalist who hadn't done much beyond the Pardoner's Tale. And I thought to myself, this is exactly the kind of thing I should be learning. Celia Sisam sounds like the kind of person I should be learning it from. So I applied to St Hilda's with immense enthusiasm, and when I was interviewed by none other than Celia herself, I took pains to mention I had read her anthology. I had read 14th century verse and prose, and I will never forget the look Celia gave me. from which I got 3 simultaneous impressions. That I was trying just that bit too hard, but that she was gently amused, and, crucially, that she was too kind to hold my callousness against me. Well, I suppose she can't have done, since my next encounter with her was during my first year of an English degree at St Hilda's, with its compulsory Anglo-Saxon. And my interview with Celia was a good indication of what was to come. She was the kindest possible tutor, but there were no flies on her. My friend Ruth Parsons, Ruth, are you here today? Then let me invoke her in absentia. She reminisced to me once about a time when she invoked a high-profile television personality in a tutorial and quoted from the book of their series. Must have been something contentious. Ruth, too, remembers the look she received from Celia, but also the immediate sure-handed steer towards a more reliable source. Formidable. It's almost but not quite the word for Celia as a tutor. She was learned to a level that can sometimes get in the way of a pedagogical calling, but it never did. She was quite often stern, but she never got impatient or irritated when you didn't know something or when you made a mistake. She grasped you firmly as you clambered upwards. She knew her students intimately, she taught them brilliantly. Above all, she took them seriously. Many undergraduates, and many of them women, didn't feel welcome in the Oxford of the mid-1980s. I know when I ventured into older institutions, I quite often didn't. But at St Hilda's, one was wanted, one was seen, one was cared about. And Celia was as good as it gets when it came to intellectual and pastoral tutelage. Is it too far-fetched to extend the connotations of that word and envision her as a tutelary spirit of St Hilda's? If I shut my eyes and I try to evoke a picture of Celia, I see her in her college room, as Lyndall's been reminiscing about too, overlooking the river. Like an owl, she'd made that her roost. She saw everything from it, I think. Like Minerva, she evoked thoughts of owls. Indeed, she'd have made a very plausible goddess of wisdom. She nested in books too. Earlier today, I attended the naming of the Celia Sisam room in the college library, and that could not be more appropriate. When I was an undergraduate, library borrowing slips were filed by name. One could see who had borrowed what. And yellowed frayed slips invariably indicated books on loan to Celia, sometimes for decades at a time. Had she mystically become one with them? Certainly appropriate enough for a student of oral cultures. She appeared to have most of the Anglo-Saxon and Middle English canon by heart. She read and declaimed those texts so beautifully, and I doubt if I'll ever hear them interpreted better. And how deftly she took my essays in hand. I remember her meticulous annotations to them in that distinctive writing we've got examples of outside, for which scholarly is the best adjective. I know just how much time that took as a university teacher now. But then the St Hilda's tutors were also good. Celia was one of a remarkable generation of scholars and teachers on the fellowship at that time. Thank you, Lyndall. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Sally. I want to remember as well Karina Williamson, not here today. What a muster of extraordinary women you were and you are. What an arts and crafts frieze you would have made. Standing together with Celia and your other sisters in scholarship, each personifying some specialism or some virtue, gesturing towards Dorothea Beale, gesturing towards St Hilda herself, as founding mothers. the kind of iconographical scheme one sees celebrating female achievement in so many 19th century girls' schools and women's colleges. I came in on the tail end of that culture, that world we've now lost. I'm so glad to have experienced it. But Celia was a transitional figure herself. There was something of the votary about her, but her horizons stretched well beyond St Hilda's. We'll be hearing about that later. And though she made the distant past speak, she was deeply engaged with the future. And, for instance, she was a strong advocate of St Hilda's going mixed. We had several conversations about it. So lovely to revisit St Hilda's and see what a success that's been. So praise to you, Celia, scholar, teacher, guardian, guide, tutelary spirit. May the college continue to remember you with thankfulness in its onward journey.
I consider it my immense good fortune to have read English at St Hilda's under Celia Sisam, Karina Williamson and Anne Elliott, and of course Lyndall Gordon and Mrs Longrig, who are also names to be reckoned with. All of them were kind and supportive tutors, and even more impressively perhaps, retained a lifelong interest in my life and career. Last weekend, preparing to speak today, I unpackaged their letters carefully from my filing cabinet, each tutor assigned a separate file. Their individual handwriting evoked in me a powerful wave of memory and emotion, plunging me back into that time, that era, my younger self, and a wave of nostalgia for the frank expression of thought and feeling that personal letters encouraged and permitted. Email is not the same. I vividly recall arriving at St Hilda's, I think it was the Wednesday or Thursday of Naughts Week of Michaelmas term, and we went straight into our meetings with our tutors. There was no prolonged Freshers' Induction Week, as we have now. Like so many new students, I was feeling socially uneasy and increasingly self-conscious about my strong Enfield accent. I hadn't noticed it before, but somehow, now I'd got to Oxford, it felt very, very painful. And everywhere I looked, there seemed to be girls from Cheltenham Ladies' College and from Benenden and from Wickham Abbey, all of whom already knew each other. I found a refuge and a direction in my work. I recall visiting with the other students, Miss Sisam, in her study, and she set us our first piece of work. My tutorial was scheduled for Monday morning, so there wasn't much of a turnaround for this. The brief, I think, was to get as far as we could with translating a section called The Martyrdom of St Edmunds from the red and yellow covered Sweets Anglo-Saxon primer. I had no idea who Alfred was or where Ancient was either, and I don't think that any of us had encountered Old English or Anglo-Saxon before. But I was so determined to show to Celia what I could do in this first assignment that instead of social activities or going to parties or discovering Oxford that first weekend, I spent the weekend strapped to a desk in the St Hilda's library, painstakingly working my way through the text and with the grammar notes and annotations finding that I could actually figure out what a lot of it meant. And this somehow meant a lot to me. The praise that Miss Sisam gave me at our first tutorial when I showed her my efforts, a very decent effort, she said, left me glowing with pride. And I think this sense of me wanting her to think well of me was one of the things that sort of drove me through my degree. And tutorials continued throughout the year, and I discovered how excited I was by Anglo-Saxon, as well, of course, as many other areas of the syllabus. But I vividly recall in one Anglo-Saxon tutorial with my tutorial partner, we were stumbling our way through the dream of the rood. And Celia was so patient and so engaged, so in the moment. And in an unusually mature moment for myself of insight, I think, for a kind of quite callow 18-year-old, I remember thinking at the time, how many dozens, if not hundreds of times, must she have gone through this same text over the decades, year after year, with other young students, sitting here, tutorial after tutorial. And yet, she makes it seem so new, so fresh and exciting, as if she's encountering the text for the first time. How does she do this? And I think that this was one of the early insights I had into what it meant to be a tutor at Oxford. So during my first year with Celia, I fell in love with Anglo-Saxon so much, I think that I was one of only a handful of students across the university that year who chose to sit a new pilot mods paper. I don't know if other people recall this. I still have the paper, so I know it exists, called Paper 4B, Unseen Translation in Old English, and some work in linguistics and philology. And I did this with Chris Ball, actually, who was at Lincoln at the time. In mods, I got good marks on this paper, and in fact on my other Old English papers and on my Latin. So I was very tempted to do course 2, but my secret love for 18th century novels, which I had been avidly consuming since the sixth form, actually won out, so I didn't do course 2. Yet, I think it was Celia's influence that made me undertake for my finals the special author paper on Chaucer and Langland. I remember cycling up the high street to visit Douglas Gray at Pembroke, who then moved to LMH as Tolkien chair, and in fact became my colleague. Celia was a brilliant tutor. She was patient, she was kind, she was passionate about her subject. She was also deeply compassionate and a strong and wise personal tutor, or moral tutor, as we called them in those days. I think that description of her as sturdy and vigorous, or the description that she wanted, the quality she sought in students, sturdy and vigorous, was really described her very well. I recall a very difficult situation in college within our year group, I think in our final year, and it was really quite painful. And I remember my close friend visiting Celia up in her rooms actually quite late one evening with her fiancé. And Celia, I think, listened and gave sound and calm advice. And the pair of them came away from her room carrying a small bottle of scotch. A move that might not now pass muster, but it seemed precisely the right thing to do on that night. And Celia, of course, also had a wry sense of humour and quite liked to tease people. I recall after sitting finals that I thought I'd just blown it completely. I remember this, as one does, you know. I talked to her about this, and she smiled, that amused smile of hers with a kind of twinkle in her eye. And she said, "Oh, I suppose you think you've got a third." And I immediately thought, "Oh God, I've got a third." And then I suddenly realised that she was pulling my leg. So, after I left St Hilda's, I went to the US on a scholarship, and I had a place at Oxford to come back to undertake my doctorate. I've got quite a long letter from that time that Celia wrote me when I'd expressed a desire to leave St Hilda's and to try out a graduate college such as Linacre or St Cross. I actually did go to Linacre. Her letter clearly and impartially and kindly set out all the benefits and advantages and the disadvantages that would come with each option. And I think from this letter, I sensed that her care for me as an individual was higher than her wish that I should remain at St Hilda's. And I think that sense of fairness or impartiality was ingrained in all that she did. I think she was very chuffed when I became a fellow of Lady Margaret Hall, which was, of course, her former undergraduate college, where I hadn't realised this, but she'd begun by reading classics and had then switched to English under the tutelage of Dorothy Everett. And I know that she had many anecdotes to tell from that time, including digging for victory, which is interesting. And I think she then became an early research fellow. I know she did research in her early years then. And she highly approved of LMH's pioneering co-educational status in going mixed in 1979. And, of course, as many of you know, she had strong views about this for St Hilda's. But I think she also thought that Lady Margaret Hall was a bit snobbish, and that the lady in Lady Margaret Hall was a pretty strong indication of its social profile. So soon after I'd started teaching there on my fellowship, she wrote to me, and this is actually a very amusing letter, I think. She said, "You will perhaps be emerging from the hurly-burly of entrance examining. I hope you had a good lot and will be able to dispel LMH's posh image. As for St Hilda's, I despair of them ever going mixed, but it's too late now." Well, of course, St Hilda's has gone mixed brilliantly while retaining some of the fantastic ingrained qualities of the former women's colleges. And I hope that Celia would have been cheered by the very unposh me taking the helm at Lady Margaret Hall. These two colleges and Celia's tutelage have meant so much to me, and I'm so pleased to be able to be here today to say so. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. When the idea of this memorial for Miss Sisam was being considered by St Hilda's a year or so ago, some current college members expressed some doubts about how many people would want to remember Celia, and thus whether it would be a popular event. Well, I think the number of people in this room provides an eloquent answer to that. Celia, Miss Sisam, was unforgettable, precise but kind, shy and polite, but clearly spoken and highly observant. Deeply knowledgeable, but drawn to the simpler pleasures of life, which were valued for their own sake. Always dressed in profoundly sensible clothes with a vestige of school uniform to them. Warm over-the-knee skirts, open neck blouses, cardigans, lace-up shoes, and sturdy stockings. A style made, some people would say, for academia, but also for the long walks that, out of teaching hours, she did love, immortalized, as some people will also know, in one memorable image from 1963, when she is featured walking on the frozen Charwell with Marion Taylor and Margaret Christie in a photo taken by Barbara Levick. Now, I am quite sure that I would not be doing what I am today without Miss Sisam. I was not a St Hilda's undergraduate, being educated instead by the Marxist Terry Eagleton at the People's Republic of Wadham College in the mid-1970s. But having discovered Miss Sisam as an undergraduate, I went to all her lectures, and we gradually got to know each other, because on occasion I had the temerity to seek her out afterwards to ask her questions. Miss Sisam's most influential lecture course for me was actually the one that might have been deemed to have been the most forgettable. She lectured on what in those days was known as Course 1, 3B, Middle English Translation 1100 to 1400. And there must be, I think, many people of my generation who remember, for example, the longueurs of translating Lyman's Brut. The whole poem is, of course, enormous, but even the extract in Bennett and Smithers' early Middle English verse and prose went on forever. And why, one might ask, would anyone actually lecture on translation texts? In Wadham, of course, I have to say, there were dog-eared versions of translations that were passed on from generation to generation and feebly memorized by long-haired beatniks the night before the exam. But Celia really came into her own with the translation texts in 14th century verse and prose, unsurprisingly, as the edition had been produced by her father, the celebrated medievalist and OUP publisher Kenneth Sisam. Celia showed you that translation was a thoughtful art and a way of gaining cultural understanding. And I've never forgotten one moment of revelation when she was taking us as a class through the extract from the B text of Passage 6 of Langland's Piers Plowman, where Piers is ploughing his half-acre and dealing with the unruly workmen, those who in times of plenty would never eat bread that banes in it were, but of cookit or crera matin, or elles of clean wheat. And I hope I don't need to translate that, particularly for the classes of the 1970s and the 1980s. Celia, smiling quietly, explained to us that clear matin meant a type of flour known as fine morning. We might think of it, she said, like sun-blessed or something of that kind. Now, in that one moment, I realized that medieval people were often like us. They gave things pet names, and those names could translate into a basic form of branding, or as we would now say, of course, influence. Suddenly, the Middle Ages seemed less alien, more recognizable, more fun. The materiality of that insight was one of those minor epiphanies that contributed to my eventually becoming a medievalist. Also, inimitable was the or something of that kind locution, the vowel in that coming out as that, reminding one of Celia's New Zealand lineage as well as her early upbringing at the posh Dragon School in Oxford. That formulation, both rather nicely permissive and with its own restrictions, was a very Celia contrivance, and I always suspected that it was actually Sisam family parlance. So at breakfast, will you have marmalade or something of that kind? Anyway, when after graduating as an undergraduate with a first-class mark on 3B, and after 3 years working in publishing in London, I returned to Oxford to do the new medieval MST on my way to a doctorate. There was Celia again, now teaching graduate philology, and she was equally quietly inspirational. I still have her marked copy of the piece I wrote on the philology of Barber's Bruce, with the treasured comment, "You should have done course 2." When I applied a few years later for the Joanna Randall McKeever JRF at St Hilda's, Celia supported my application. When she retired in 1986, I subsequently succeeded her as lecturer, college fellow, and then official fellow. I think there are probably a few people here this afternoon, Lyndall, Julia, Janet, Elizabeth, possibly Christine, who will be some of the few surviving people who remember Celia's retirement do, which was held in the Vernon Harcourt Room in 1986. And she gave remarks in which she reflected on all her years at Oxford. But some of the most telling reflections she shared were about her time as a student at LMH in the post-war years of rationing and austerity. She spoke with affection of the bracing coldness of the college's unheated bedrooms and the lumps of substance distributed to create an evening drink, which were affectionately known by students as tea Kofko, their true provenance remaining obscure. Celia's generation were, in their own way, toughies. They valued quality, but they knew how to manage on what you have and to value that too. And after Celia retired, I moved from my teaching room, the one I had in Hall Building, into what had been her bedroom off the top stairs in South Building, which was repurposed. It was, of course, not ensuite, heaven forfend. And I was not surprised to find that it entirely lacked heating. Now, Celia, as everybody has said, was a marvellous tutor, clear, insightful, and very observant. In preparing me to be her successor at the college, she kindly let me sit in on the admissions exercise in 1985, along with Lyndall and Karina Williamson. Surrounded by UCCA forms, as they then were, all three tutors took careful notes on candidate interviews. And I observed that Celia's notebook had a coding system which identified some candidates as GVG. Now, following Lyndall's remarks, you may be able to work out what that stood for, but I was an innocent. So looking at this, I asked Celia, does that mean good stroke very good? And I was told, no, it means good, vigorous girl. She did accept, I think, that not all girls would be vigorous, and that may be a relief to some people here, but she wanted, as Lyndall said, a good crop of them in the mix. And having been a tutor here thereafter for some 20-odd years, I can entirely attest that she was right. When I came to St Hilda's as a JRF, I was living in, as was Celia, as has been mentioned. And that was, I think, the last year of a custom that subsequently died out, whereby on Saturday nights, the smaller part of the Fellows' Common Room in South was converted into a dining room for a small dinner for primarily residential fellows. You might see Celia, Margaret Christie, Barbara Levick, Irene Alt, and the younger JRFs like me. Occasional non-residential fellow interlopers, such as Margaret Rayner or Hilda Brown, were treated with a slight but distinct foie d'oeil if they turned up. And after such occasions, Celia would suggest that fellows might like to repair to her large teaching room upstairs for a nightcap that was invariably a small, neat vodka, infused, as she would say, pointing to the bottle, with the herb beloved of the European bison. Among the JRFs, as you can imagine, there was considerable speculation as to where this proclivity came from. But it reminded one that within reason, Celia did enjoy letting her hair down. During my first Christmas season at St Hilda's, I found myself roped together with Celia and Barbara Levick by a lengthy string adorned with matchboxes as we hid in a cupboard in South during an extended game of sardines. The next morning, we all went into breakfast in the dining hall as if nothing had happened, as indeed it hadn't. Now, Helen is going to say far more about Celia's scholarship. What I would want to say is that she was an expert philologist, a crisp and adroit editor, and a very sensible literary critic. She talked about writing a Middle English grammar when she retired, but I do not think her heart was in it. She wanted to get on with the next phase of her life on Scilly, and which lasted nearly 40 years. She valued the loyalty of friendship and what she saw as the potential of every student. After she retired, I regularly wrote to her about the academic fortunes of those students she had taught, and she unfailingly replied with friendly and pertinent recollections. She clearly had loved St Hilda's, but knew it would change, and was brisk and unsentimental about that. When she revisited the college during her retirement, that was also evident. The bursary that she quietly established when she left did what she herself had spent so much of her time doing, enabling women and students to do their very best. With all of you here, I salute her.
Good afternoon. First, an explanation of how I became Celia's goddaughter. My mother and Celia were school friends in Oxford during the war because her father, the Kenneth you've heard of, and my grandmother were colleagues in the civil service during the First War. And I first went to stay at Middle Carn in Scilly, aged about 10. And of course I knew Celia enjoying life away from Oxford, but of course recognised her academic interests and skills and the value and the integrity of her research. There were times at home when her preoccupations with publishing deadlines, etc., caused her to mention her work, often in connection with a review that she'd been asked for, or something urgent and personal about one of her students. But generally, work was work, and the vacations were for other activities. Life at Middle Carn was active, busy, and happy. She liked having people with her. She was an indefatigable hostess, warmly welcoming family, friends, colleagues, and other academics. There were many repeat visitors, school friend Susan Bailey, colleagues, including Margaret Christie, whom she taught to row the little rowing boat which we call a punt, not an Oxford punt, a little one, dinghy, Anne Elliot, sharing a love of botany and taking a typically rigorous approach to it, Anne Whiteman, a historian at LMH, who became an expert in pulling in large pollock, and Vivian Russell, a Cornish archaeologist who was expert in revealing secrets of the landscape. Being another Anne, and the junior, I was Anne 3. Middle Carn, the house, has only 3 bedrooms, but somehow people were squeezed in. When necessary, younger folk such as me were in the boat shed, which is a decent solid annex to the house, but had also the onions and the garden tools and things like that in it. And Celia camped on what we all call the veranda, which was actually nowadays what you'd think of as a sunroom. She'd made sure all were comfortable, well fed with fresh fish and garden produce, and had every chance to enjoy the beauty of Scilly and to discover it. We walked, swam, fished according to the weather, and harvested apparently endless supplies of vegetables. Expeditions to other islands in the archipelago followed a standard pattern of hastily but carefully prepared picnics, decisions on whether to take bathing things, and a discussion about the best place to visit in the prevailing weather, all very practical. Once there, her local knowledge and experience ensured we all had an enjoyable day. If the house was not full, there would still be plenty to do. Horticulture according to season, botanical walks, including a weekly connection for the museum's natural history section flower table, only of common wildflowers, mushroom foraging, blackberrying, and so on. Celia particularly enjoyed swimming. She was elegant and efficient in the water, and whenever the weather and tide would allow, she would swim before breakfast as well as later in the day. I think the sea was really where she could relax and prepare herself for what was ahead. There were also regular visits to and from local friends. Whenever she was in Scilly, she was faithfully helped by family friend Betty Sherris and her late husband Arthur. Betty had been the housekeeper and carer for her father when Celia was here in Oxford. And they both kept everything going brilliantly while Celia was away. And it was a really special, invaluable partnership and friendship. It wasn't one-way traffic. Celia would come and visit me at least once a year. While still teaching, she valued summer term visits to me particularly because I lived by the sea and she could relax and swim. After retirement, she would organise a kind of royal progress between various friends and meet their friends and relatives too. She was also able to catch up with my mother, by then retired. And a visit to her dentist was also included, hosted by Robin Myers, and influenced the timetable and itinerary. Celia treasured her New Zealand connections and heritage. She made several visits home, as it were, and explored other countries en route, often with Margaret and Susan. I feel that everywhere she went, she cemented academic and other friendships, and where possible, these people made the complicated and, to them, somewhat baffling journey to Scilly to enjoy Celia's home and lifestyle. Going back to her life here, I'd like to read an excerpt from a piece by Ian Hislop in The Listener in June 1986, and this goes back to the occasion of her retirement lunch. Hislop wrote, "Celia Sisam has not featured on any front pages recently. Anglo-Saxon Don in retirement shock is not quite the sort of headline that most editors are looking for from an Oxford story, but it has its own appeal. Miss Sisam has been teaching the joys of Beowulf to students since 1957, and there was a lunch for former pupils, including my friends, to wish her well in retirement. She was given a bicycle as a present. Anybody remember? And though by the standards of Fleet Street this is not an excessive golden handshake, she was apparently delighted with it. Someone suggested the bicycle should be named the Wanderer, after the Anglo-Saxon poem of that name. Hislop says, I always thought this was a rather miserable poem, but then she did not teach me. And certainly she was cheerful at the thought of riding round the Isles of Scilly after leaving Oxford. That bicycle was indeed in almost daily use, and when it perished, she was given another one to celebrate her 80th birthday. Celia had a soft spot for cats. Toby moved with a family from Oxford. Jacko was a local cat who succeeded him. He had a long and comfortable life as I grew up. After him, a succession of cats found Celia, recognising that this comfortable home with fresh food, sunny sleeping places, and affection on tap was the place to settle. I never met Puss, the final cat. That's the one in the picture on the back of the programme. But I gather he made the transition from outdoor self-sufficiency to faithful indoor companion as well as any. As Celia and her friends got older, large gatherings became a thing of the past. Celia spent more time indoors, enjoying reading the paper on the veranda and doing the puzzles, particularly Sudoku. The veranda provided a great view not only of the sea, but also of passers-by and boats out fishing. Locals would drop in, and with Betty and Arthur usually around too, news would be shared, local issues debated. She still always enjoyed good food, and chocolate, and wine, and whiskey. Don't remember the vodka, but anyway. She was a selective television watcher of certain dramas and documentaries, and particularly enjoyed Wimbledon and snooker. She listened to Radio 3 upstairs with her morning tea, but otherwise music didn't appeal, sadly, and neither did needlework, definitely not needlework, or drawing or any of those sort of creative pastimes. I think she used to read detective stories in bed late at night, but I would have long since gone to sleep. Finally, I've spoken about how I and her visitors loved staying with Celia, but here is an excerpt of a letter from her to me in June 1970, which is a glimpse of what she loved so much about Scilly and what a precious haven it was. She wrote, "At this moment, I'm sitting in a very large examination room in full academic dress, which is not designed for this weather. They are doing Anglo-Saxon, and there is a good deal of uneasy foot shuffling, etc. I've just been home for a week, a pre-examining holiday. Scilly was superb, much cooler than here, and sunny and beautiful. Somehow, when time is short, one packs more in. I had a succession of social engagements and a private expedition to Nornor, which is an uninhabited island, where the men of works have been doing further excavations. One of the diggers is a friend of mine, and that was Vivian, the archaeologist, and I saw her too. On my last day, I caught 7 pollock. That would be illegal these days, you're only allowed 3. Altogether, a very enjoyable break. I have much to thank Celia for, as we all do. The example she set and what she gave to me and to many others. Her integrity, kindness, generosity, wise guidance, and all-round good company. She introduced me to a multitude of interests and left so many happy memories. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to speak about Celia, as I'll presume to call her, although I have to say I did not know her as well as all of you have done, but I hope she would pardon the informality. So, the occasions when I met Celia were some years ago, and were in connection with her scholarly work for a rather obscure, perhaps, book club with the splendid name, the Early English Text Society. It does exactly what it says on the tin, and is called the EETS for short. So from her EETS work and from other sources, some people who could not be here today have very kindly corresponded with me with their memories, and I've incorporated those remarks in my paper, but they overlap with what so many of you have already said, so I need to keep it short. I'll begin my account of Celia as a scholar with her own description of herself as a young woman. It's properly terse, but I hope we may read between the lines. It comes from the letter that she wrote in support of her application for her fellowship at St Hilda's. She had had a typical Oxford academic family's upbringing. I was born in 1926 and educated at the Dragon School, the Oxford High School for Girls, and at Lady Margaret Hall, where I was a pupil of the late Miss Dorothy Everett, who was another stalwart of the EETS. I specialised in Old and Middle English literature and philology, and also studied Gothic and Old Norse. So that's one side of Celia at the outset of her career, a redoubtable young woman, alumna of the smart and academic Dragon School and Oxford High School for Girls, as well as a dedicated philological scholar. She graduated from LMH in 1947, but this is a difficult thing to say perhaps in the present audience, but it must be said, with a second-class degree, not the first that she and her tutor, Miss Everett, had hoped for. As things turned out, this was actually a blessing in disguise. The reasons why she didn't shine in schools were because, and I say this as a former tutor myself, she was a scholar and a philologist. She was not a dilettante. As Miss Everett explained, Celia had probably been a victim of her own perfectionism. Her assessment was typically astute. Celia's undergraduate work was outstanding, especially in philology and textual criticism, and I fully expected that she would be placed in the first call in schools. That she was not, I attribute to the fact that she is a slow writer and did not cover enough ground in her papers. She has a really independent mind and takes nothing for granted. Confronted by a difficult problem, she sets herself to examine the essentials and to build up her own opinion. Now, given a cast of mind like that, I can well believe that Celia was unlikely to have shone in 3-hour papers in the peculiar conditions in the exam schools, in which candidates write at top speed, with very little time for deliberation, and where flair and panache have perhaps tended to be rewarded by board examiners over more substantial and enduring virtues. For Celia's scholarly publications consist of short essays and editions of medieval texts, in both of which she set herself to solve the many individual problems which they created. I'd say that though austere, her writings are in their way quietly brilliant, if that's not too much of an oxymoron. They are gems of acuity. The lengthy monograph was not for Celia. After graduation, she was able to direct her research decisively towards paleography and the study of manuscripts, though philology always underpinned her work. She was a meticulous scholar, as everybody else before me has observed, who enjoyed puzzles and loved detail, and probably believed in detail more than generalization. Another of my informants, a distinguished paleographer of this university, described her to me less formally as a shrewd cookie. At this point, you may think this is a bit odd, but I'm going to hope that some of you may have read the 1932 novel by Stella Gibbons, Cold Comfort Farm. Now, why do I say this? It seems to me that Stella came up with exactly the right phrase to describe the qualities that distinguished Celia's work, and indeed her entire personality. That is, the higher common sense. This describes the rare and special qualities of intelligence grounded in sensible appraisal of the balance of probabilities. The emphasis is on higher. We are not talking about ordinary common or garden gumption, useful as that is. As a researcher, Celia now hoped to get stuck into those puzzles which had tantalized her as an undergraduate. Dorothy Everett described her again in another reference, and this time I hope you'll allow me to abridge and paraphrase. Yes, Celia was formidable, others have used that word. But, and this rather amuses me, her former tutor was at pains to soften this picture of a ferocious philologist by assurances that Celia was quite human, she could converse rationally, and didn't growl in a corner in obscure languages. She not only had what Miss Everett called good taste, but she did read things that weren't written in Old Norse or Gothic. In short, she would be an ornament to any senior common room among the women's colleges. You may think that this shows the inevitable gender stereotypes only to be expected in the 1950s. And of course, yes, it does. But Miss Everett did also insist that Celia had an uncompromisingly logical mind. It has to be said, and this was the circumstances, that her family background helped Celia. And I hope you'll agree that Dorothy Everett's little vignette of her, though dated, gives a good picture of the Celia that you all knew, with an added touch of St Trinian's. Miss Sisam's father is secretary to the delegates of the Oxford University Press, and she has had the advantage of contact with the best minds in Oxford. But even without that, she would be an addition to the intellectual life of any college. In manner, she is frank and direct, and though not without some shyness, she knows how to hold her own in any company. I should add, perhaps, that she is a very good hockey player. Well, a more informal gloss on that might be that when confronted with great minds, Celia would know how to behave civilly and without recourse to that ultimate weapon of mass destruction, the hockey stick. In 1948, Celia took up an assistant lecturership at Queen Mary College, London, under the distinguished professor, later Sir John Sutherland. Here she continued her teaching of Old and Middle English, and had she wanted, her career was now assured. QML offered her a permanent post. But this wasn't what Celia really wanted. The London job gave her little time for research, and so she returned to LMH to take up a short-term research fellowship. And in 1953, 3 articles promptly followed, all in the Review of English Studies. She was laying down the solid ground of publications that she needed in order to secure a permanent job. 2 were concise, paleographical, codicological studies of relatively obscure texts. And then in the third, she gave her views on the authorship of the 13th century poem, The Owl and the Nightingale, a standard part of the curriculum then and for many years afterwards. The author's name is unknown, but might have been Nicholas of Guildford. Celia's fellowship at LMH had been renewed until 1953. But as Celia herself candidly, indeed one might say bluntly, told the interviewing panel in her application to St Hilda's, "I should like to have a more permanent post in a place where I could pursue my own research and have access to manuscripts." Well, I think many of us could have said the same. But Celia hastened to assure the board that she did recognise the job's everyday realities. "I enjoy teaching and should be glad to give most of my time to it, at first." Italics mine. As Dorothy Everett had also said, Celia was unfailingly honest. Teaching, of course, as those who have spoken before have also said, was Celia's métier. As Dorothy Everett said, she has a gift for it. In spite of her youth, Celia was not yet 30. She is fully capable of holding her own. She succeeds in being frank and direct without giving offence. And perhaps most important, she has a good deal of common sense and a sense of humour. Meanwhile, Celia's first book was already in the press, as she told St Hilda's. From 1953 to 1956, I was engaged on an edition of the unpublished Salisbury Psalter. Now that's to say, a late 10th century manuscript now preserved, yes, in Salisbury Cathedral Library. I'll say more about it in a minute. She was editing it jointly with her father Kenneth, who had begun work on it before the First World War, but had abandoned it in 1915 for probably understandable reasons. Kenneth Sisam himself was a distinguished scholar as well as the head of OUP. And he and Celia went on to collaborate on several other projects. They specialised, you might say their forte, was anthologies for the use of students. Father and daughter were engaged on the Oxford Book of Medieval English Verse, an anthology for students, which Celia described in her application as having a purely literary purpose, and we hope to make the book intelligible to readers who are not used to Middle English. The specialist knowledge required to prepare such books as these anthologies is terrific. Let's not consider them for a second as a source of mere set texts. Kenneth's 14th century verse and prose, first published in 1921, was frequently reprinted. Celia and Kenneth's joint Oxford Book of Medieval English Verse appeared in 1970, was reissued in 1973 after Kenneth's death 2 years earlier. And at the time of Celia's own death, she was engaged upon an early Middle English primer, which was also to have been published by OUP, but sadly was unfinished. I need to say a little bit about this collaboration between Celia and her father. Thanks to their shared intellectual interests, the relationship between them was essential to their scholarship, jointly and severally. I know I'm supposed to be talking about Celia, but in describing her, Kenneth cannot be entirely left out. And he was himself a dominant and indeed scary figure who needed careful handling. But Celia, a strong woman in her own right, was certainly not just working in her father's shadow. In their shared projects, each took on different parts of the work as their primary responsibility to reflect their overlapping areas of expertise. However, of course, as joint authors, they supervised each other's work. As I've said, my knowledge of Celia comes from her work for the Early English Text Society. And it's in this context we return to the Salisbury Psalter, which was her principal publication for us. She was also served for 11 years as a member of our council, our governing body. And it was in that context that I met her myself. It has to be said that the Salisbury Psalter was nearly all prepared by Celia rather than her father, though both editors shared the responsibility. Celia had prepared the text, footnotes, and most of the introduction, though doubtless supervised by Kenneth. So, in brief, what is the Salisbury Psalter? It's a unique, late Anglo-Saxon manuscript containing the Latin Psalms and accompanied by a running commentary and translation in Old English. Celia and Kenneth's edition was published in 1959 for the ETS by Oxford University Press. It is an understatement to describe it as a very complicated book. More accurately, from the production point of view, it was a beast. Supervising its production fell to two of Kenneth and Celia's fellow New Zealanders and friends. That's to say, Robert Birchfield, the secretary of the ETS, and Professor Norman Davis, its director. Their friendship was tested but stood firm. The published Psalter itself is a marvellous example of what OUP's traditional hot metal printing methods could achieve in the good old days. It far exceeds what modern electronic typesetting can do. The two Sisams' whole account of their procedures in setting the work out occupies only a single page in this book. It is a masterpiece of concision. It may be said that neither of the Sisams ever wasted words. So, 4 New Zealanders put this book together. I'll have perhaps more to say about Oxford's so-called New Zealand mafia in a moment. It was a remarkable phenomenon. Depending on your interests, you may be disappointed or relieved to hear that the term has nothing to do with organised crime. Norman Davis and Robert Birchfield assisted the Sisams enormously. And meanwhile, the ETS's council, which also included Kenneth, was engaged in frank discussions on how on earth the society was going to pay for this monster. The printing was horribly expensive. Kenneth, and he the head of OUP, was bullying the council to have it printed by a German specialist in Heidelberg. No one doubted Kenneth's words that such a wissenschaftlich printer would undoubtedly know what he was doing, but he was very expensive. Eventually, and grudgingly, Kenneth agreed to getting OUP to do the work. If the council insisted, which it did, then the work the OUP would have to do. He was rather huffy about it, it must be said. There is no alternative to printing by the press if we must keep to this country. They will at least do the work creditably and with least worry. Now, just to bring the point home, those remarks were made by no less than the chairman of OUP's Board of Delegates. I'm guessing that Celia was probably glad to leave this locking of horns to her father and his male circle. Interestingly, Celia wasn't quite the only woman to have been involved in writing this book. It is acknowledged in the preface that Celia's mother, Naomi, otherwise a shadowy figure in the records of Celia's life, contributed extensive collations of readings from other manuscripts. And that's no trivial task. Of course, nowadays there's a much cheaper way of reproducing such books. That's to say, photographing them and printing them as facsimiles. But it's still very expensive. I am assured, however, by correspondents who've helped me out with this paper, that Celia's and Kenneth's book still retains its value, especially as a teaching aid, and I'm sure that would have pleased them. But in 1976, for her next book, Celia edited yet another Old English manuscript facsimile, a more famous book. At least undergraduates reading English will have heard of it. This is the so-called Vercelli book, which, yes, is kept in the library of Vercelli Cathedral near Milan. This book was published in Copenhagen for the prestigious series Early English Manuscripts in Fixed Facsimile. And Celia and her father had already published work with this series through their work on the Paris Psalter in 1958. So, the Vercelli book, written by a single scribe, was perhaps, as Celia suggested, one man's private collection of devotional writing in verse and prose. Many pieces are unique to the book, of which the most famous is the poem now called The Dream of the Rood. How this Old English anthology ended up in Vercelli is anyone's guess. That it did offered a wide field for speculation. Scholars usually propose some variation on what might be called the lost luggage theory, that the book was left behind by an English traveller going to or from Rome. Perhaps the party did too much shopping in Italy and had to leave something, couldn't fit it in their suitcases. Indeed, Kenneth worked up a very slender conjecture into what almost verged on a short story to account for this mystery, or as he called it, a purely conjectural reconstruction. Celia's views on the possible original ownership of these manuscripts betrays, I think, an endearing trait and one at the heart of her scholarship, and that is her attachment not only to St Hilda's, but more broadly to the cause of the education of women, which in the 10th century meant nunneries. She suggested, both in her discussion of the Salisbury Psalter and the Vercelli book, that both manuscripts may perhaps have been made or at least kept in communities of English women religious who needed to restock their libraries after the Viking raids in the 10th century. Perhaps the Salisbury Psalter had belonged to the very prestigious Benedictine nunnery of Shaftesbury Abbey, just 20 miles from Salisbury. Rigorous scholar as she was, Celia pressed her arguments no further than she should, than what she called slight indications. She wasn't quite the first to propose that this book might have been kept by nuns. Edmund Bishop got there first, as Kenneth pointed out. As Celia put it, the book's old-fashioned script might point to a scribe working in some small house, perhaps a nunnery, where an English book was needed for private reading. The book also contained sermons, which indicated an audience of mixed laity and professed religious, so that meant an abbey. So pending some new discovery, these ideas can only be surmise. Celia urged her arguments no further than she should. But she was most certainly right to remind her readers and present company not to overlook traditional women's educational institutions. Meanwhile, her remarks, especially in her facsimile of the Vercelli book, remain what one of my correspondents described as a mine of important information and analysis. Of course, what might be called Celia's cautious feminism has been followed up by other Old English scholars, but it was Celia who pointed the way. I've already indicated how clannish the remarkable group of distinguished New Zealand scholars in Oxford were in the 20th century, first and second generation. You can understand why they were nicknamed the New Zealand Mafia. Kenneth Sisam might be described as their godfather. There was also Dan Davin of the press, Robert Birchfield, Norman Davis, Douglas Gray, and Jack Bennett. Celia knew all of these people very well indeed, especially Norman Davis, who took a rather fatherly interest in her work. Celia herself was, of course, born in England, but nevertheless, her New Zealand identity was vital. She visited there in 1973. Kenneth Sisam, born in 1887 in Opotiki, had seen at first hand the effects of the imposition of British government on the Maori way of life. Aged just 11, he had been sent by his parents to a remote settlement to be toughened up by hard traditional agricultural work. It had evidently been a profoundly formative experience. No picnic, like the modern New Zealand bush holidays advertised today. Celia carefully kept a letter which Kenneth had written in 1916 describing his experiences. As Kenneth summed it up, the picturesque, represented by the Maori way of life, and the efficient, the British government, don't go well together. Kenneth and Naomi had built their family home, Middle Cairn, because the Sillies reminded them of New Zealand. The Sillies are still an old-fashioned rural and fishing community where the locals welcome visitors in the summer but close in on themselves in winter. They live independent, hard-working, self-sufficient lives. St Mary's had, when I visited some years ago, a strange, remote and magical atmosphere, and the place is covered with prehistoric monuments. So then, it was here that first Kenneth and then Celia found their place, where they could be themselves and where the picturesque and the efficient could coexist. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Niamh Keogh. I'm the Rebecca Marsland Career Development Fellow in English and Medieval English here at St Hilda's. And it's been such a privilege to hear all of your memories of Celia. I'm very pleased to introduce 3 of our current English students today, who will read from a selection of psalms and hymns in Old English, which were edited, as we've just been hearing about, by Celia and Kenneth in the Salisbury Psalter. So Miranda McLaughlin, also a second year Course 2 student, will now read from hymn 8, the Magnificat.
Je miklat min sol dritten, on je fagenod min gast on mire goda hala. Fortham he je se I ad nessa histinena, efna hionon forth iale kneonesse yadi mesechaf. Fortham he dide me michlathing, se de michte is, und hali his nama. Und his mild heutness of forchenednesse on forknauer, tham thrakiendem hine. He dide michte on his erma, he tostinkte o vermode of mode his hortan. He assette ulanka of settler, und he obsetta iad mode. Hingriende he je filde of godem, und weli he forlet idela. He onfing Israel his knappan, je thankol his mild heotnesse. Swa he sprak to faderum urum, Abrahama und his offspringer, on woralde.
And lastly then, Sandra Lewis, who is a first-year student, will finish by reading the Nunc Dimittis.
Nu forlat thine theo andrite, after thinum wada on siba. Forthan yezoan mine egan thina halle, that thu je aruadest before an ansine earla folka. Leot tu auregenesse theoda, und wuldra thinnes folkes Israel.
Hello, I'm Daniel Wakelin. I'm one of the Fellows in English, and I'm the Jeremy Griffiths Professor of Medieval English Paleography. I won't speak for long because we've just heard the Nunc Dimittis, which we just summed up beforehand as "bye now." But unlike many people here today, I did not know Celia Sisam. I arrived at St Hilda's a quarter of a century after she retired, and I became involved with the Early English Text Society, about which we've been hearing, well over a decade after she demitted from that. But as one of the secretaries of that society, I did exchange post with her when she renewed her membership well into her 90s. I also feel I've grown to know her over the last 6 months. That's because in college, one of my duties is to be involved with the library as library fellow, and I was delighted when we learned that her executors were sending to us over 1,200 of Celia Sisam's books and an archive of her papers to do with her research and teaching. The library has excellent holdings in medieval languages and literature, thanks to a long tradition of distinguished medievalists such as Kathleen Chesney, Kathleen Major, Beryl Smalley, Dorothy Whitelock, and many more. I can't name everybody today. And Celia Sisam's papers make the perfect complement to that. Going through them, I know that Neve and I, and also the library staff, have got a full sense of her intellect and also of her social world, a world of academia half a century ago, strangely familiar yet also unfamiliar in many of its mores and methods. From their wide correspondence, it was no surprise to see that so many people would want to come and pay respects and share their memories of Celia Sisam. She was clearly had a wide circle of friends and students and acquaintances. And I want to thank everybody on behalf of the Vice Principal, I think, for coming along today to share memories of Celia Sisam. Perhaps I might also, on behalf of others, thank those who've spoken today and those who've arranged today's event, the events team, the development office, and the library staff as well, and especially perhaps the Vice Principal for putting together the programme with such care. We hope that you've enjoyed this afternoon's talks, and I think now we are all invited to tea in the pavilion, so I hope you'll have time to join us there. Thank you very much for coming.